Hello, welcome to our presentation on Convergent Evolution and the Ordovician. This is a presentation brought to you by the Trilobite Trekkers, aka Ashley and David. Take a look at these two images. What do you notice about these animals? What physical features or abilities do they seem to share? I would take a few seconds to pause the video and think about this. So, you likely notice that both of these animals share similar looking wings and the ability to fly. Despite the physical similarities of their wings and the fact that they both evolved the ability to fly, bats and birds are quite different. A bat's wing is more like a human arm than a bird's wing. This is an example of today's video topic, convergent evolution, as it is a shared ability with independent origins. Here we can compare a human arm, a bird wing, and a bat wing. I wanted to include this visual to express better what I introduced previously. As described on the last slide, the bat wing is more anatomically similar to the human arm than the bird wing. The bird and the bat evolved their abilities to fly through convergent evolution. Just pointing it out here, you could see that, again, this bat wing looks a lot more like the human arm than it does the bird wing anatomically. Here are the goals and objectives of this video. I'm not going to read through all of them for time's sake, but you could pause and look at them. Okay, so introducing convergent evolution. This is part 1 of our presentation. So convergent evolution occurs when organisms that are not closely related independently evolve similar features or behaviors as solutions to similar environmental challenges or problems. It can result in matching body shapes, color patterns, or abilities. The emphasis here is on the fact that the organisms are distantly related. This indicates that even though they may look or behave in a very similar way, the similarities evolved independently rather than coming from a common ancestor. This phenomenon can be observed all over the tree of life, and as we see in the diagram on the right here, all these different animals have a streamlined body shape, adapted for life underwater, but they come from very different times and they're all very different animals. So before we get more into convergent evolution, we must answer the question, how do new traits arise? So one reason is mutation, and mutation is a process that creates genetic variation. Mutations create slightly different versions of the same genes, called alleles. These small differences in our DNA sequence make every individual unique. These small differences make up for many variations we see in humans, like hair color, skin color, and susceptibility to disease, for example. And the same idea applies to other organisms besides humans. Genetic variation is very important because it helps populations change and survive over time. So helpful variations, or those that assist organisms in survival and reproduction, are passed down to the next generation. Not so helpful variations, or those that hinder organism survival and reproduction, are often not passed down, and usually become eliminated from the population with time. This natural selection can sometimes lead to significant changes in the appearance, behavior, or physiology of individuals in a population within just a few generations. I'd also like to mention meiosis and sexual reproduction here, because once new alleles arise from mutation, the processes of meiosis and sexual reproduction combine different alleles in new ways, increasing genetic variation. Okay, now we must answer the question, why do similar traits show up independently? Or in other words, why does convergent evolution occur? So there's two main reasons for this. One is where convergence frequently happens when two different organisms need to adapt to the selective pressures of comparable environmental conditions. Some selective pressures may include predators, food availability, or extreme temperatures. An example that's very useful for demonstrating this cause of convergent evolution is the evolution of thick water-retaining leaves and spines on cacti and euphorbia species, which tolerate extreme drought but are native to separate continents. Another reason why convergent evolution can occur is occupation of a similar niche. So a niche is a role an organism plays in a community, influenced by environmental factors and interspecies interactions. When two different organisms inhabit a similar niche, such as the cryptic green coloration of emerald tree boas from South America and green tree pythons from Australia, both living high up in the canopy of similar rainforests and preying on birds, convergent evolution may also occur. Now we have to answer the question, can convergent evolution happen millions of years apart? Yes, it can. So, different species have evolved similar traits and attributes when separated by oceans, continents, or even by millions of years. Ichthyosaurs and dolphins provide a prime example of convergent evolution that fits these criteria. Based on fossil evidence, ichthyosaurs first appeared around 250 million years ago, while the earliest true dolphin species appeared around 13 to 8.5 million years ago. Despite living in our oceans hundreds of millions of years apart, they evolved very similar body shapes. This suggests that these animals experienced similar conditions and lifestyles, even with millions of years separating them. Understanding convergence between extinct and extant species can shed light on the ecological conditions creatures were experiencing millions of years ago. Okay, so to demonstrate just how far apart ichthyosaurs and dolphins evolved, I included this little picture on the right here, where we could see that the first ichthyosaurs came about way before the first dolphins. There's several million years between these guys. Okay, welcome to part 2 of our presentation, or connecting convergent evolution to the Ordovician. So, just to briefly overview the Ordovician, this period took place 488 to 443 million years ago. This period, part of the Paleozoic era, saw a boom in marine life and the first appearance of primitive land plants. During this ancient period, most of the world's land masses converged to form the supercontinent of Gondwana, encompassing Africa, South America, Antarctica, and Australia. Gondwana gradually moved southward and eventually settled near the South Pole. The land masses that would later form North America was part of the supercontinent of Laurentia, separated from Gondwana by the narrow Iapetus Ocean. Initially, Proto-North America was positioned along the equator, although it was predominantly submerged underwater. And just to point out a few key things here, here's the Laurentia. We could also see the Iapetus Ocean, and then Gondwana over here. Okay, so Ordovician climate. So during this period in time, Earth's climate was mostly warm and wet, with tropical conditions covering most of the Earth. There is some evidence of cooler climates in higher latitudes, but for the most part, Earth would have had warm and wet and tropical conditions during the Ordovician. And these tropical conditions would have allowed for the formation of tropical cyclones. There were also higher sea levels than those of today, and in some places the sea levels would have been almost around 2,000 feet above those of today. These high sea levels would have caused extensive flooding of the continents. There were also very few primitive plants during this time and a lack of widespread vegetation. So, too, using various means such as carbon isotope measurements from preserved Ordovician soils, scientists believe atmospheric carbon dioxide levels would have been between 14 and 16 times higher than today. These high levels were driven by widespread volcanic activity. Additionally, the extensive flooding and lack of vegetation on land would have suppressed the weathering of silicate rock. And silicate rock weathering is a major mechanism for removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So, in a way, there would have been a lot of carbon dioxide entering into the atmosphere during this time and very little removal during the Ordovician. And towards the end of the Ordovician, Gondwana took up its polar position, and massive glaciers formed over Africa at the supercontinent's center. This would result in a 20 million year ice age and mark the end of the shallow, biodiverse seas that characterized the period. Here's an artist illustration of some of the life you would have found living in the seas during the Ordovician. I won't get into too much detail here, but still, some of the living things found in this image include trilobites, which are these guys, cephalopods, which have this long cone shape, and brachiopods down here, as well as the focus of our connection to convergent evolution, or the bryozoans, which would be all of these coral-looking structures, but they're not coral. Okay, introducing bryozoans. So bryozoans, or small filter-feeding invertebrates, can be found in freshwater and marine habitats. In most species, tiny bryozoan individuals, known as zooids, form colonies that encrust surfaces, develop branching structures, or in freshwater species create gelatinous blob. So each zooid, too, is only around less than a millimeter in diameter, so they're really small. And despite their small size, marine bryozoans are abundant in many fossil assemblages due to the preservability of their hard calcium carbonate skeletons. Okay, so these are some of our favorite bryozoan finds, or some of our original images of fossils from our fossil hunting trip. We could identify the species with the star-shaped individuals on them as Constellaria florida. See our VR exhibit to learn why not all bryozoan species are easily identifiable. And these are the Constellaria florida. You could see the little star-shaped individuals there. Okay, now that we've talked about bryozoans, we have to discuss corals. So corals belong to class Anthozoa within phylum Cnidaria. They typically form compact colonies made up of many identical individual polyps. Each polyp is a cylindrical creature with a mouth surrounded by tentacles. And despite what many people think upon first glance, corals are animals, not plants. Corals secrete calcium carbonate to create a hard skeleton that forms the basis of coral reefs. Corals have a mutually beneficial relationship with a type of algae called zooanthellae. The zooanthellae live within the coral polyp's tissues. Zooanthellae remove waste from the coral and perform photosynthesis, producing oxygen and carbohydrates. The coral consumes these byproducts to build and maintain its reef structure. Okay, so Ordovician bryozoans versus modern corals. So the earliest bryozoans appeared in the early Ordovician around 480 million years ago. Corals appeared as solitary forms in the fossil record starting around 400 million years ago. They evolved into modern reef-building forms, or the corals that we know today, over the last 25 million years. And two, there's many similarities between both Ordovician bryozoans and modern corals. So they're filter feeders, colonial organisms, and both have those calcium carbonate components to them. But there are some important differences, such as the fact that these Ordovician bryozoans and modern corals are from completely different phyla, with the coral being from Cnidaria and the bryozoans being from phylum Bryozoa. And also, too, the calcium carbonate structures built by coral are much stronger than those of Bryozoa. Getting a little more into what I mentioned on the previous slide, here's a diagram that illustrates how animals are classified. The broadest classification is domain, which is at the top of the pyramid, or this large one over here. And the most specific classification level is the species at the bottom. Most people are at least somewhat familiar with the species level of classification. You're familiar with this classification level if you know a few species of bears, birds, or fish, for example. And since phylum is one of the broadest classification levels shown here, it's the third one down from the top, and bryozoans or corals are separated at this level, we should know that they're very different organisms. Here's another resource that further demonstrates what I explained on the last slide. It's from the Digital Encyclopedia of Ancient Life, and it depicts animal phylogeny. Again, we can see just how unrelated coral, which are members of phylum Cnidaria up here, and bryozoa are, which is all the way up or all the way down here. Very different phylums. So, investigating convergent evolution in Ordovician bryozoa and modern coral. As we've seen, these organisms have similar body plans and living structures, feeding mechanisms, and adaptations. However, these organisms are very different biologically and evolved millions of years apart. But this may serve as an interesting example of convergent evolution. We kind of have to consider some of the selective pressures from the Ordovician and the Oligocene, because the Ordovician is where the first bryozoa came about, and the Oligocene was where the first reef corals came about. So some potential selective pressures. So I included some that might have occurred during the Ordovician and those that occurred during the Oligocene, because the Ordovician is when we saw our first bryozoa, and the Oligocene was when we would see the first modern reef corals. And I would take a few seconds to look over those. Although there might have been some differences in the selective pressures created by the Ordovician versus Oligocene environmental conditions, we know that changing climate and temperature were shared among the two. These selective pressures, and some that might be a lot less obvious, could have contributed to the convergent evolution of Ordovician bryozoans and modern corals. And although there are no research studies, at least that I can find, that directly discuss convergent evolution between Ordovician bryozoans and modern corals, there are many pieces of information to suggest that it has occurred between these different organisms. And again, between looking at their very similar body plans, their very different phylogeny, and then similar climate-related selective pressures, it seems like it could have happened. And after all, both types of organisms independently evolved these traits rather than diverging from each other after the traits were already present. Thank you for joining us for this presentation. So I've decided to conclude this presentation with an important and relevant quote. Things are not always what they seem. The first appearance deceives many. This is a fitting way to wrap up our brief exploration of convergent evolution. As we have observed, many species that appear closely related due to similar appearances and features are not closely related. For example, Ordovician bryozoans and modern-day colonial coral may look similar. Still, they are quite different when you delve into their phylogeny, biology, and other characteristics. Fortunately, convergent evolution helps to dispel some of the initial deception and aids in our understanding of how two biologically distinct organisms can evolve to have very similar features, even if they lived millions of years apart. And thank you for your time and attention. Lastly, here is a comprehensive list of references. Thank you again.